It's a brand new season of the Politicrat Daily Podcast. For conversation, information, and revelation, join me, Omar Moore, every day for a brand new edition of the Politicrat Daily Podcast. Politics, news, issues you care about, guests, and commentary, all on the Politicrat Daily Podcast. So please join me for every new episode. Subscribe now. And thank you very much for your support.
Its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Sunday, January the 17th, 2021. That was Dwight D. Eisenhower in his farewell address as President of the United States, exactly 60 years ago today, January the 17th, 1961. That may have been one of the, if not the most important farewell addresses in the history of United States presidents. Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell address was such an important thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but particularly and specifically the part about the military-industrial complex. Then and today. Coming up next. Now there's a brand new webpage, especially for this podcast. The Politicrat Daily Podcast can now be found on thepoliticrat.com, a brand new page that centralizes all of the places that you can listen to this podcast, the major platforms, and many others at thepoliticrat.com. Lots of content that you can see there right now and every single day. So subscribe now to the Politicrat Daily Podcast and make sure you visit thepoliticrat.com. Thank you.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Sunday, January the 17th, 2021. That was Dwight D. Eisenhower in his farewell address as President of the United States, exactly 60 years ago today, January the 17th, 1961. That may have been one of the, if not the most important farewell addresses in the history of United States presidents. Dwight D. Eisenhower's farewell address was such an important thing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but particularly and specifically the part about the military-industrial complex. Then and today. Welcome back. Dwight D. Eisenhower's address, exactly 60 years ago today, the farewell address he gave to the United States as he bid adieu to the office of President of the United States, is a message that has been much studied in American history. Dwight D. Eisenhower served 2 terms as President of the United States from 1953 through 1961, at least, of course, to January the 17th, or rather just a few days after that, January 20th of 1961. His vice president, to give you some context, his vice president was Richard Milhouse Nixon. Some people seem to overlook that, but it is very important not to overlook it, because I think Nixon played, among others, a very key role in the kind of thing that Eisenhower warned of, this military-industrial complex. As a general, and he was the last general, to become President of the United States, he fought in a war here and there. He certainly fought in wars. I believe it was World War II. And he knew what war is about. He knew. And as a military man, he knew exactly what that was. So more than anybody, he had tremendous insight into the need to avoid any more ratcheting up of the military in this country, the militarization of the country. He had seen enough of it in America. We're looking at what happened in 1945 with Truman, a Democratic president, Harry Truman, dropping nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki within 3 days of each other, August 6th and August 9th of 1945. And those bombs killed, if you added up really the totals unofficially, probably about 500,000 people were killed. Or I should say murdered as a result of what the United States did, dropping these atomic bombs on civilian populations in those 2 Japanese cities. Japan had disbanded its army. It had become a pacifist nation after that. And, they've really tamped down on military dramatically in Japan since then. But the United States has not. And so that's the atmosphere that Eisenhower was coming through and coming into, and then became president of the United States in 1953, won the election in 52. And 2 terms. Eisenhower was far from perfect. He did some things as well with corporations and did some other stuff that was not, it was rather unholy. I don't want to sit here and paint Eisenhower as some kind of saint. The operative objective here to speak about Eisenhower is to speak specifically about what he said in a portion of his farewell address in 1961, exactly 60 years ago today. And that's about the military-industrial complex. And I think that Richard Nixon played a sizable role in that. Here's a guy who, as Vietnam was breaking out, the Vietnam War was breaking out, America did not begin the Vietnam War in that sense. There was this war going on. They didn't join it immediately. They joined it, I think, around the mid-1960s, early 1960s. Could have been 64, could have been 65, but the blueprint was there. The war, French Indochina, all of the, as it was called then, all of these, this was hotting up before 1965 and 64, right? This had been going on for a little while before that. And so the South Vietnamese were having peace talks in 1968. And this is long after Eisenhower left the scene. And his vice president back in 1953 through 61, the early portion of 61, was Richard Nixon. And then 7 years after that, Richard Nixon, who had lost, of course, who had lost, right? He had lost the election just a few months, like 2 months or so before Eisenhower gave that speech. Because, as you know, Nixon lost to Kennedy by barely 100,000 votes. And that speech that Eisenhower gave was given, roughly 2 months after his vice president lost the presidential election. But not to be unbowed, literally 7 years after that speech, a bit more than 7, almost 8 years, about 7.5 years after that speech, Nixon would commit treason by scuttling those peace talks that the South Vietnamese had in Paris in 1968. Anna Chennault was a kind of a somewhat double agent, if you will, that Nixon used to spy on and scuttle the talks, and Nixon himself, who was trying again in his bid for the presidency in 1968, had, as someone, again, who is not a head of state, committed treason by telling the South Vietnamese, listen, you need to withdraw from these peace talks. You need to do so because I promise you, I can get you a better deal than what you are presently negotiating for. And as a result, if you walk away from this in Paris and I get elected, I guarantee you are going to be set. And the South Vietnamese did just that. And this was at the behest of someone who wasn't an elected official, who was doing an end run around Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, who was himself not going to run again. And obviously, because of the disaster of Gulf of Tonkin, which was really the thing that killed LBJ, it wasn't, I don't think it was signing the Civil Rights Act. I don't think it was signing the Voting Rights Act. These things, Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act, which followed in 65, Civil Rights Act was 64, these were things that there were some in the country who supported Dr. King and others, and there were some who didn't. But this was accepted once it happened. I mean, of course, there was always violent resistance in parts of the United States. But it happened, and that was not why LBJ refused to run for another term. He refused to run because of Vietnam, and because he was tremendously unpopular in the country because of it. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, where he lied to the nation and said that these American boats were being attacked, which they hadn't been, in the seas off of wherever it was, Tonkin, the Gulf of Tonkin, right? And that led to the escalation and America getting involved in the Vietnam War. And they would be involved for at least, another 8 years or so, if not more. And they withdrew in the 1970s, early 1970s. The helicopters falling into the sea in Saigon and all of that. And that, of course, was coincided with Nixon. So, look, I want to just get to this because Nixon was This military industrial complex, this is about GE, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, all of these companies, these corporations that either built or manufactured, built armaments, the military, whether it's weaponry, nuclear weaponry, whatever it is, right? The parts were assembled at these places, say in Colorado and New Mexico, and there still is Lockheed Martin, I think, is the world's number one maker of weaponry and munitions, weapons for war, for defense. These big defense contractors. And this is the kind of thing that Dwight D. Eisenhower was talking about in his farewell address. We need to guard against that. And Nixon accelerated it, but he accelerated it domestically, even more so than in foreign policy terms. And when you think about that, that escalation of the military-industrial complex has continued to this day. We've gone from Nixon, who did this in 1968, even before he was elected. It was happening actually before he was elected. Why do I say that? In 1968, and I will submit to you, and I've said it here before on this podcast, that 1968 is the most consequential year, arguably, I think, in the history of the United States of America. Now, of course, there was enslavement and the Emancipation Proclamation, which was not official law. It was actually an executive order of some kind, if I remember correctly. And don't forget, it was still at least another couple of years or more that black people were freed from bondage and enslavement, particularly in the South and in Texas, specifically in Juneteenth, and black people who were enslaved not being informed for at least 2 or 3 more years after the proclamation. And the proclamation, again, it was like an executive order, which could be subject to being overturned by the next president that comes in. That's how this happened. This was the Emancipation Proclamation was not a law. It was not a law. And so that's why you had the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to ratify. And then, by the way, the 13th Amendment had not been ratified until months and months later, if not a year or so after it was first enacted. You got to understand that this is very tenuous stuff. When people talk about democracy and constitution and law, this stuff is all very tenuous, especially when it comes to black people. So speaking of black people, in 1968, you had the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And tomorrow, here in the United States, it is Dr. Martin Luther King holiday, Dr. Martin Luther King Day. Very important day on the calendar, very important date on the calendar. His birthday was just last week, just last Friday. I did a podcast episode about that and about specifically white America and why white America is in trouble. And you need to listen to that. No matter who you are, you need to listen to that episode. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968, and it took nearly 25 years, if not more, to get his birthday, in place. It was just unbelievable, but not surprising either, actually. It wasn't surprising. It wasn't that unbelievable. It was heinous and disgraceful. And in 1968, you had this militarization had ramped up. In fact, you can go back to just a year after Eisenhower gave that farewell speech. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Kennedy facing off with Khrushchev. They both faced off. And for 13 days in October of 1962, the world was literally hanging off the edge of a cliff as to what was going to happen. Those nuclear weapons were pointed at the United States from Cuba, literally 90 miles away from Florida, And for 13 days, it was extremely tense in not just the United States, but around the globe. The very planet's existence hinged upon what was going to happen between these two men. And fortunately, we are still all here, right? Because this planet's still here. In rougher shape as it is still here. So we can be thankful for that. And that crisis was averted. And Khrushchev withdrew, and the world lived on to commit more murder and more genocide and more... But the point is, the world lived on. But you see what I'm talking about, or you hear what I'm talking about. And then Kennedy would be assassinated just a year plus later, in 1963, November of that year. Then you'd have what happened with Malcolm X being assassinated in 1965. And then you'd have, the Gulf of Tonkin was 64 or 65, I guess, around there. And that happened. So there's already this militarization, the lies that LBJ told. And then it got to Nixon. And Nixon just ramped that up. And he ramped it up on the streets, too. Of course, there was a violent reaction even before he came into office because, people were very, very upset, to say the least, that Dr. King was assassinated. So there was this militarization on the streets. Police with their shields and riot gear and this and that, and RFK telling them all to calm down, and not to calm down, but please, he wouldn't have wanted this, Dr. King. I just want to tell you tonight that the Prince of Peace has been murdered tonight in Memphis, and that was a moment because, of course, 2 months after that, RFK would be murdered. He'd be assassinated. So 1968 was a really consequential year. I think it's the single most consequential calendar year in American history, in U.S. history, certainly. And some people will, I just think that 1968, if you look at everything that happened in that year, so many things changed. Mostly for the worst, actually. Very little of it for the better. I think the vast majority of it for the worst. And I can go into that in another episode, which I'm sure I will too, why that year is so important in U.S. history and arguably in global history. Excuse me. But Richard Milhous Nixon ran on a law and order mantra. And so that happened in 1968. Law and order, law and order. And we need a redress to all this violence in the streets and, these people, and it was really, he was talking about black people and hippies and the yippies and all of that. And the hippies and yippies, the Young Independent People's Party, I believe was what they're called, Jerry Rubin and company, and the Weather Underground and Tom Hayden. This is all 1968, the 67, 68, the trial of the Chicago 7, and all of this militarized. It wasn't just police, it was a police state. It was a militarized state that happened after all of this. And then also to deal with the uprising in black neighborhoods around the country, then in 67 as well. In Detroit in particular, and in Watts, in Southern California here, in Southern California, south of here, good 300-400 miles south. You had uprisings in Oakland, California, which is not that far from here. In San Francisco is, 13 miles east of here, not very far at all, across the Bay Bridge. And then you had this going on all over the country. People were angry, and justifiably so. And this is about Dr. King being assassinated, but it's also about the profound racism and inequities and the discrimination and the Jim Crow and everything else that was oppressing black people, that was forced on them, a system of whiteness and oppression that was forced on them, that was punishing black people, that absolutely made black people's lives a living hell. And all the police brutality and the killings of black people, that has not stopped. And so this militarization continued and continued. And Nixon utilized it with his law and order campaign in the 1968 election. And it worked. And his treason worked. And then he got into the White House by barely a percentage or 2 percentage point over Hubert Humphrey. The Democrats were in disarray. Nixon comes in, right? He continues to ratchet up Vietnam. And then you've got this full-scale musculature of foreign policy and domestic policy. And the foreign policy is being implemented in America, on American streets. And it has been for long before Nixon, but it really came into vast relief, in focused relief, in 1968. And it culminated from LBJ, and even before that with Kennedy to a degree, even though he claimed he wanted to draw down. Kennedy certainly didn't have clean. Kennedy had some unclean hands as well. And so all of this, and Malcolm X talked about this in 1964, I believe. 1963, chickens coming home to roost. And that's why he was punished by the Nation of Islam. Because he talked about the weeds of violence, the seeds of violence choking its chief gardener. And he was talking about JFK, who had been assassinated, I think, literally a few days before Malcolm X said that. And so Nation of Islam leader, Honorable Elijah Muhammad, was the person who said, you are going to be silenced for 30 days or 60 days. I think it was 30 days. And then thus began the rift between the two of them, Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. But I travel around the parts of 1960s American history. Like it's very much present. But I also travel around to get to framing this militarized situation. It was heavily militarized in America. And again, it had preceded Eisenhower to a degree. But Eisenhower was the person who really, while in the Oval Office, warned about this. He really warned because he knew as a general what this could lead to and where it could lead. And thus it began, right? Then you had all these people coming into the White House, ratcheting up the military, ratcheting up the police presence, budgets in Congress being passed to militarize the streets, particularly the streets where black people live. You had this with Democratic presidents like Bill Clinton. He was one of the people that really ushered this in. And even before that, when Nixon won a second term, using that same law and order platform essentially, while Ehrlichman and others were putting out these memos about black people need to be criminalized and we need to do this and we need to do that and we need to do the other, and that thus justify all this police presence in these neighborhoods, these occupying forces, not the neighborhood cop that would come in to white neighborhoods and check on you and find out how you were doing and, hey, can I get your cat out of a tree? Can I, that kind of, no, that wasn't going on in black neighborhoods in the 1960s, nor was it going on in the 70s, nor you could argue was it ever going on when black people, were, having their homes in the United States. I mean, look, the police as an entity in this country were founded upon the backs of black people as enslavement patrols. That was their origin, to corral black people, corral runaway enslaved black people. That was their invention. That's where they came about. We didn't have police in this country as we know them now for a number of years. I mean, it was somewhere in the late 1800s. I don't even remember the exact year. But police as we know them did not really start for a long time after the enslavement patrols began. And they were modeled right off of those. That's where they started. And police today still behave that way towards black people, as if we are runaway slaves, as if we are runaway enslaved black folk, runaway enslaved people. That's how we're still treated. And so this militarization keeps ratcheting up. It never stopped. And it was militarization not only in foreign policy terms, but it was also domestic terms. And these budgets in Congress, and again, bipartisan budgets, defense bills, and then you'd look on page 873, and there would be the provision about extra militarization of neighborhoods and police departments. And you've got these police unions that are so strong now, and you've got tanks on your streets in Ferguson in 2014. Like, what the F is this tank doing here? People are exercising their First Amendment rights peacefully, passionately. They're coming out against the murder of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And you've got this blooming tank. You got these tanks. You got these grenades being fired at you. You've got, tear gas being fired at you. I mean, this is a military zone. You would have thought you were in Iraq. And all of this ratcheting up, and then not to mention the guns and all of that, and it continues. You're passing budgets. You're passing $740 billion budgets, bipartisan, but you had to hem and haw just to get $600 of a stimulus check passed. That took months and months in the middle of a pandemic, no less, that's killed nearly 400,000 people in the United States. Shows you where Congress's priorities are. All the while, there was this militarization, and it continued with Obama, it continued with George W. Bush before him, God knows, 2 wars, lying us into a war that he never got impeached for, and now somehow W is fondly remembered. Isn't that interesting? And sick. But Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us about all of this. And that warning was maybe eyebrow-raising in 1961. But as time has distanced us, especially now, 60 years from the time he spoke, his words are even more stark, especially now, than they were exactly 60 years ago today. Because it's playing out all over the place. It's so brazen. Never mind all the other interventions and invasions this country has done since he spoke about that, and all the people that this country has killed in our name, in your name, in my name, taxpayers. If you live in America and you're paying taxes, right, your money is going toward the killing of innocent civilians in other countries. And what's Joe Biden going to be doing? Will he draw down? President Obama, by the way, had committed more drone strikes around the world than any other president. And that still stands. Even the guy who is not president, who's going to be leaving in, 3 days? 4 days, whatever the heck it is now. 3 days' time, whatever. Even that guy did not have as many drone strikes as President Obama. But nobody likes to talk about that because one of them is a Democrat, the other's a Republican, so we can't see this. And I think that's a fatal mistake. That's why I say there's no loyalty as far as I'm concerned with politics, because both of these parties do things. And I know it's this poison both sidesism, but not in this particular instance, because this is real. We've had Democratic presidents ramp up military. Bill Clinton, to me, is one of the worst offenders at it. What is it with sending out a strike against, a military strike, a missile strike against Sudan, and you blow up a aspirin-making plant, and you kill a load of civilians? And then after 9/11 happened, and then all this hyper-militarization with George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, who really was the one running the country. I mean, that's what I'm getting at here, folks. And that stuff has never stopped. The ads you see the ads all over your television on a Sunday talk show, Sunday mornings, right? If you watch the Sunday morning cable news or broadcast news, Sunday morning TV shows with the politicians that go on them, I'm not going to mention the names of them because I've stopped watching them, but I'm sure you have too. But if you are still watching them, you see these companies, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Archer Daniels Midland, they more agribusiness or aggressively ripping people off and ripping off agriculture and farmers. That's what they are. And whether it's somebody else, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, I forget all the other ones, GE, these are all military contractors. They are. This is what Eisenhower's talking about. This is what he warned about, and that we must never let this proliferate. And unfortunately, those words by Eisenhower have fallen on deaf ears. They fell on deaf ears. Basically, what you've seen is generations of presidents laughing in Eisenhower's face or at his words, or laughing at him, as if to say, what is that old fuddy-duddy general know? What is he talking about? And sadly, we've not learned our lesson. We've not learned our lesson. And I think it's because we don't care to want to. And I think it's because people are greedy. And I think it's because billions upon trillions of dollars get made in war. And I think it's because the stock market shoots its load off, shoots its wad off, literally. I mean, I know that conjures up a picture for some. But it does. They do. The stock market absolutely shoots off, gets its rocks off when war is afoot. All of these military contractors, their stocks are absolutely through the roof, scaling the Empire State Building in New York quicker than lightning. I mean, seriously. Next time there's a war that gets started by an American president, and I pray that doesn't happen again, but you know it will. Next time that happens, or next time America finds itself involved in a war, beyond the ongoing ones that are still going on, that people have long since turned away from, look at the stocks of Lockheed Martin. Look at the stock price, of Lockheed Martin, Archer Daniel Midland, but more so Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman. Those are the three. Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and General Electric. All four of those. Watch their stock price. I guarantee you all of those stock prices will be through the roof. That's the secret. It's a dirty one, but it's not so secret. And my big concern again goes back to what I said a couple of days ago. With the militarization of the streets in Washington, D.C. We saw this in June of last year when Donald Trump deliberately, with the coordination of the Attorney General at that time, Bill Barr, because he's now gone, deliberately militarized the streets against peaceful people. And this is not the first time it happened. Look at Kent State. Look at Orangeburg in South Carolina. Look at all these other events, right, where people ended up being killed. And it was this militarized presence of all these police just agitating to shoot their guns off like some kind of, premature, inadequate man trying to have sex and trying to last. I mean, it's just absolutely criminal. It's criminal. Tear gassing people walking down the street. And the thing is, like I said before, on Friday's episode, this past Friday, there were some black people in that crowd back in June 1st, 2020, in Lafayette Square, Lafayette Park, Plaza, whatever you call it. But I've got to say to you, the majority of those people were white. So let me tell you something. If white people, like I said in that episode where I said white America is in big trouble, they just don't realize it yet. You got to remember that they were firing at U2. And I'm not talking about the Irish rock band U2. I'm talking about you, Y-O-U, 2, T-O-O. And my goodness me, if that don't wake you up, nothing will. If Kent State didn't wake you up where white people were also shot dead, nothing will. Nothing will. And again, here we are. Here we are. We've got this militarization. I understand there's reason for it. We had this terrorist attack here on January the 6th, 2021, with these thugs and violent terroristic people, these white people who just stormed that place. I know there's one, you'd probably see the odd Asian person here and there, but that's not the point here, right? The point is that you had this violent group of people who were intent on killing politicians, and those politicians were black, white, Latinx, Native. They wanted to get rid of them, commit murder. Do you understand? They had a noose, they had gallows out there, built a noose, ready. Some people with zip ties, for God's sake. These terrorists with zip ties. This is what's going on. And now you've got this big military presence around the United States Capitol building. Again, I heard someone on Sky News saying something like 20-something thousand, 25,000 National Guard. And they're all armed, by the way. This ain't like 2 weeks ago when they were unarmed and there was a few of them. This is 25,000 National Guard armed, descending upon the U.S. Capitol building and around it and in it. I mean, that is militarization. DC police, Secret Service, this is all heavy duty hardware. I mean, I half expect to see tanks on Wednesday as the very important swearing in, and I pray that it is safe. The inauguration of, first it's going to be Kamala Harris who gets sworn in first, by the way, as vice president, making history in that position, the first woman, the first female vice president, and the first black woman as vice president, the first South Asian as well, making history. So she'll make history. And then Joe Biden will be sworn in after that and become only the second Catholic president and the oldest person to be sworn in as president. The only other Catholic president was JFK. We need to pray for the safety of this swearing in, by the way, and also for them throughout and for all politicians and for all of us, because you're going to have this violent militaristic thing and you're seeing it. And then you've got these military thugs charging the Capitol. Very well organized. It wasn't a mob. It wasn't a riot. It was a tactical operation to absolutely decapitate the United States government. That's what it was. Nobody wants to talk like that because it frightens the bejesus out of the average person, right? But they'll show you the video on a loop and traumatize you. See, I think it's much more of value and consequence to explain and offer historical reference and then to talk about the ramifications and explain what happened rather than show you video of masses of people being violent, because all that does is traumatize you and shock you and disturb you. And it doesn't educate you on anything, quite frankly. But that's the concern. Now, you've got Eisenhower's words, are basically pissing in the wind. Excuse my French. I mean, that's what those words mean in 2021. You've got AK-47s on the streets. You've got the average person. You've got a 17-year-old terrorist, thug, murderer in Kenosha. Some white boy, 17-year-old terrorist. His mother indoctrinated him into it. His mother, I think, served in the military. And she has all these guns strapped to her back and front and sides, and then she passes that on to him. So that makes her a bang-up great parent, doesn't it? To pass that on to her 17-year-old. And then he becomes a petty little terrorist thug. And by the way, he's not petty or little because he killed 2 people. And he should be getting the max. He should be treated like an adult. So he should be getting a big sentence. So he's not petty. He's extremely dangerous. And he's violent. And he's a killer. And this is the thing that just gets me, because there were tanks on the streets of Kenosha as well. And there were all these vehicles, I believe they were tanks, but there were these big police vehicles. This just last year, August of 2020. This guy can actually kill 2 people, and both of them are white. Again, you think that this is only about black people, and so you're going to just keep sleeping on that because you don't care about us. But we've been telling you forever, as I said on Friday, please listen to that episode, right? And so he's killed 2 of his own, right? Shot the arm off of another one of his own, right? And then the police, white cops, let him go, even though he's told them that he's killed 2 people. So you've got militarization, right? And the cops let him go. And he's got this AR-15 that he brought across state lines. That's a crime as well, federal. So he's done that. He's violated that. Federal and state crime, I think. And they're hemming and hawing about him. And you've got all this military. Trump wanted this military parade. Remember that? Oh, I want a military parade like Kim Jong-un and like the French do. I want a military parade. And that, of course, that got squashed. But again, I look again, even more significantly than that, to what's going on now with this 25,000 I mean, this is just no way a country should be living. When you've got education needs that aren't being met, you've got people starving and dying on these streets because they've got no home. They've got domestic violence abusers. They've got hunger. They're desperate. They have to steal. And I don't condone people stealing, but it's a system again. And here, that's the but, right? A system of violence and a systemically violent country, as well as a viscerally violent and physically violent country. And so people react to that. But it's just that the people who steal something at a local grocery store will have the police come down on them and maybe even kill them, particularly if they are black. But those same police look the other way and let a violent, murdering, terroristic thug who is 17 years old to just walk free of charge, like Monopoly, go past jail, and just let him go after he's murdered 2 people and severely injured another person. That's not only a physically violent society, that's a systemically violent society. And like I keep saying, because that's the police. And then you've got the death penalty. You've got the state as a killing machine. Another brother was executed federally by the feds, by Donald Trump, on Saturday, early Saturday morning, I believe it was. Dustin Higgs, the latest person, another black person, murdered by the state, federally. That's the systemic violence that I'm talking about. So he's put to death instead of saving money to keep that brother alive, to keep him in prison for the rest of his life. And maybe he can start to study, like Malcolm X did. Study, read the dictionary, read books, and then become something. Although Malcolm X was not in prison for life. Although he might beg to disagree had he still lived. He'd tell you that America is a prison. So maybe we are in prison for life, black people. Maybe all of us, but especially black folk. But Dustin Higgs, he could have been spared. All of these people that Trump has put to death now over these last few days, weeks, and months could have been spared. Come on. You don't tell me that Lisa Montgomery couldn't have been spared. The brother Bernard couldn't have been spared. I can go down the list. But you see what's happening, right? So all these white men who murder, who kill, these white males who kill and murder, yet nothing happened to them. You know, Trump pardoned these people in Blackwater who did all this evil in Iraq, killed civilians, raped civilians. But no, I'm pardoning you. Bye. I'm pardoning you. And then, but you black folk and you females, you women. Oh, you're gonna get the death penalty. I'm gonna, yeah. But that's the violence of the system, and that's another thing. That's the system's violence. That's the state's violence, right? The poverty is a systemic violence. People aren't just poor because they're poor. It's because there's a system that's in place that takes resources and gives them to the rich, which the rich stole in the beginning from the Native Americans, from the Mexicans, from black folk. I mean, come on. And we built the country. Chinese built the railroads, worked on them. Black folk built these buildings, built the White House, built the U.S. Capitol. We enslaved black folk. We did that. We didn't get a penny for it. But you see what I'm getting at here. So all of that happens. And hey presto, voila, nothing. We don't get anything for it. And we still love the country. And yet there's still this violence going on against us. And then you don't do anything when thousands of people storm a U.S. Capitol building, the U.S. Capitol building. And belatedly now you've got the response of 25,000 people with guns, armed, National Guard. Now, what if that had been done before? That request should have been put in months ago, weeks ago. It's not like this violent attack wasn't planned. And it's not like people didn't suspect what could happen. And it's not like people didn't know in early January, in late December, that this was going to happen. I mean, come on, folks. Come on, people. You had adequate time to get National Guard. But you see, this is the thing that Eisenhower talked about. Security and liberty. That most important portion of his address was the part after was also when he said about security and liberty must take place. You can't have one without the other. You've got to have both of those. Because security can end up being a bullock, a block, an obstruction to people's liberty and freedom to move. And we're seeing that. It's happening right now in D.C. but quite frankly, across all 50 state capitals. This militarization, open carry, been going on for decades. Oh, you can still bring, up until recently in Michigan of all places, where a governor's life was being threatened, where they were absolutely going to kidnap and kill her. Up until recently, literally a week or two ago when this terror attack happened, you could still bring a gun into the legislature, loaded. As a civilian, you could still bring a gun into the chamber of the legislature and stand there and watch legislators conducting their daily business for the people of Michigan. Isn't that the most absurd thing? If you're looking at this and you're listening to me in another country right now, you agree with me, right? Isn't that the most absurd thing? Why do people in America, why do people in the United States do that? And some of you here in the United States would say, what an absurd and dangerous and just absolutely psychopathic thing to do. And now, Michigan has stopped open carry inside legislatures, in the state legislature. Oh, we're not having that now. They had to wait till 5 or 6 people were murdered, or killed, but there you go. Always reacting, never, very rarely putting proactive steps in. We have to wait till people die before, maybe we'll decide to wake up, or maybe we'll just do a cost-benefit analysis. And so, we can afford to let a few people die. But you see, open carry should be abandoned in every state, but it's not going to be. And I get it, the tradition of hunting, and I get that, I understand that. But look at Canada. Canada has twice as many guns at least as we do. But yet, they're not killing people at the same rates that we are. And I get it, there's less people in Canada than there are here. But still, disproportionately, it's just crazy. But that's the militarization. And I am worried about not just Wednesday coming and, not just that, but lots of things to come that I hope don't happen. That's the sound of me knocking on wood. Dr. Martin Luther King talked about this too in his speech Beyond Vietnam, and I'll be playing some of that speech coming up in tomorrow's episode. So that's a sneak preview as we get toward Dr. Martin Luther King holiday. Celebrate that tomorrow on the official day of the national holiday. And I just want to leave you with that from Eisenhower. I mean, that security and liberty, it got curtailed to a degree on 9/11. We had the Patriot Act that also accelerated this militarism in the country. A system of violence ends only one way. A society that has a systemic violence is a society that can only end in one way, unless we reverse what we've been doing over the last 60, 70, 100 years, if not more. The question is, will we? Will we heed Dwight Eisenhower's words? Thank you for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I am Omar Moore.